My son, George, always had a knack for attracting the oddest kids. I don't know why, but throughout his younger years, he seemed to pull in the weird ones like a magnet. There are plenty of stories I could tell, but one stands out like a thorn in my memory. At the time, George was in 4th grade. We had just moved across the country because of my husband's new job assignment, and George had to start at a brand new school. Luckily, George was naturally friendly and outgoing. He had never struggled to make friends before, so we weren't too worried. The transition seemed smooth, for him and for all of us. Everything was falling into place perfectly. I felt relieved. When I first met the other parents at his school, everyone seemed decent, normal people working hard for their kids. It all looked promising. That changed a few months later. I got a call from the school in the middle of the day, asking for a parent to come in regarding an incident involving George and another student. Since my husband was tied up at work, I rushed to the school. I remember feeling a mix of anger and confusion. Anger because if George had gotten into a fight, he'd have consequences. Confusion because George wasn't the type to pick fights. It just didn't fit him. When I arrived, George wouldn't answer any of my questions. He kept his head down, silent. That unsettled me even more. George was normally a chatterbox. The principal met with me privately first, asking general questions about George's behavior at home. Was he respectful? Did he have anger issues? Any problems with authority? I answered honestly. George was polite, kind, and had never been aggressive. Finally, the principal explained the reason I was there. After recess, George and another boy, Sebastian, were the last kids coming back inside. Out of nowhere, George had allegedly pulled an eraser from his pocket and smacked Sebastian in the head with it, hard enough to knock him to the ground and make him cry out. I was stunned. George hurting someone unprovoked? It just didn't make sense, especially because George had mentioned Sebastian often and always fondly. They were supposed to be close friends. I pushed for more details, but the principal admitted there were no witnesses. They had only the 2 boys' accounts to go on. Since it wasn't a serious injury, they weren't pursuing any harsh punishment, just a warning and a call home. I left the meeting feeling unsettled, but relieved that it wasn't more serious. Driving home, George stayed silent, staring out the window. It wasn't until just before bedtime that he finally opened up. What he told me chilled me. George said they were playing a made-up game, something like Street Fighter. Sebastian had instructed George to lightly hit him with the eraser as part of the game. George did it, assuming they were still playing. But as soon as Sebastian hit the ground, he started screaming. He leaned in and whispered to George that if he didn't pretend to have hit him for real, he would hurt George for real. George had no idea what to do, so he went along with it. Teachers believed Sebastian's story. I was furious. I decided to address it directly. Using the school directory, I found Sebastian's mom's number, Maggie, and gave her a call. To my surprise, she was very kind. She told me she was already aware of the incident, that Sebastian had confessed and that he'd been punished. She even admitted that Sebastian had some behavioral challenges, sometimes acting as if he were a different person. I felt a twinge of pity for her. Maggie suggested that perhaps a sleepover would help the boys mend their friendship. Reluctantly, I agreed. Maggie volunteered to host. That weekend, I dropped George off at their home. Maggie greeted us warmly. She invited me in for a glass of wine while the boys went downstairs to the basement to play. We chatted for a while. She seemed genuinely nice. Eventually, I asked a few delicate questions about Sebastian's behavior. Maggie lowered her voice and admitted that Sebastian had been struggling, but she was optimistic. Doctors believed he would grow out of it with time and patience. She reassured me George would be safe. Feeling cautiously hopeful, I left. But next day, when I picked George up, He was standing at the door, smiling. But as soon as we pulled out of the driveway, he started crying. Through tears, George told me what had happened. Everything had been normal until bedtime. They were sleeping on inflatable mattresses in the basement. George woke up to the sound of whispering. Dim, flickering light was coming from the nearby bathroom. Not normal light, but something like candlelight. George stayed perfectly still, peeking through half-open eyelids. He saw Sebastian standing in the bathroom mirror, talking to himself. But not as Sebastian. He was calling himself Mr. Jim, holding an entire conversation with his reflection. George froze. Then the light went out. George squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. Moments later, he felt Sebastian crouch over him, whispering in some garbled, chilling language. George lay absolutely still until Sebastian eventually crawled back to his mattress. In the morning, Sebastian acted totally normal. When George finished telling me, my blood ran cold. I called Maggie immediately. At first, she laughed it off, calling Sebastian imaginative. But when I pushed, her tone changed. She admitted that Sebastian had more serious issues than she had let on. Some doctors suspected possible dissociative identity disorder, and apparently, they'd had to move several times because of past incidents at other schools. When I asked why she hadn't warned me, she begged me not to report anything to the school. I told her I'd think about it, but the decision was taken out of my hands. The following Monday, Sebastian assaulted another child on the playground, this time badly enough to get expelled. When I tried to reach Maggie afterward, her phone was disconnected. When I drove past their house a few days later, it was empty. They were gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye. It was like they had vanished. George eventually forgot about the whole thing, but I never did. To this day, I still wonder what else might have happened that night in that dark basement if George hadn't woken up.
This happened when I was 18 years old. My parents and I had decided to take a short road trip across Sweden, and I brought along a close friend of mine. We'll call her Anna. The plan was simple: drive 8 hours north, visit a famous amusement park, and camp overnight nearby. The only thing we hadn't done was book a campsite ahead of time. No big deal, or so we thought. We arrived at the city where the amusement park was located, but we had planned our visit for the following day. That meant we needed a place to stay overnight. Since we had packed tents and camping gear, my dad started looking online for nearby campsites. He managed to find one that seemed promising. It was close, affordable, and had good reviews. He called. Unfortunately, they were completely booked because of a major soccer tournament happening that weekend. Strike one.
My dad kept trying other campsites, but it was the same story everywhere. Either full, too far away, or outrageously expensive. We were running out of options. Finally, he suggested we find somewhere wild to camp. In Sweden, Allemansrätten allows you to camp in many natural areas, as long as you're respectful and cautious. We set the GPS to the nearest nature reserve parking lot, hoping to find a safe place off the grid. Eventually, we found a gravel parking area surrounded by forest. When we arrived, there were still a few people hiking nearby. We asked one of the women if it was safe to camp there overnight. She assured us it was perfectly fine. No rangers checking permits, no strange activity. Based on her advice, we decided to stay.
It wasn't ideal. The gravel lot was isolated, dark, and hugged by thick woods. But it would have to do. There was also a beach, about a 10-minute walk through the trees. At first, we considered camping closer to the water, but something told us to stay near the car. We unpacked quickly and set up 2 tents, one for my parents, one for Anna and me. While helping with the tents, I noticed an old beaten-up car parked further away on the edge of the lot. No one was inside. I thought it was weird, but shrugged it off. Maybe a hiker had left it there. After wrestling with tent poles and ground tarps, we finally finished setting up. Anna and I crawled into our tent, playing YouTube videos on my phone and snacking on chips. It was already around 11 p.m.
We agreed to get some sleep soon so we wouldn't be exhausted for the amusement park. By midnight, my parents were already snoring in their tent. Anna and I were just about to fall asleep when we heard it. A metallic clatter, sharp and sudden, like someone dropping a shovel onto gravel. We both bolted upright. We stared at each other, wide-eyed, neither daring to speak. The noise had come from the direction of the abandoned car. We sat there in total silence, straining to hear more. A few seconds later, there was a heavy thunk sound, like something being shoved into the trunk of a car. Then, the loud slam of a trunk lid slamming shut. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. We didn't move. We barely breathed. Moments later, we heard tires screeching, the old car tearing away at high speed. For a minute, we sat there stunned. I grabbed my phone and texted a local friend to ask about the area. He responded almost immediately. Don't camp near that beach. Criminal gangs use it sometimes. Sketchy stuff happens there. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. 10 minutes of tense silence followed. Then came the worst sound yet. A man's scream, deep, guttural, blood-curdling, echoed from somewhere in the forest. It was the loudest, most terrifying noise I'd ever heard. Anna and I clung to each other, completely frozen. I texted my mom. We heard a scream. When she didn't answer, I called her. She answered groggily and said she hadn't heard anything, reassuring us it was probably nothing. But I knew better. There was no way that scream was nothing. Anna and I stayed awake, huddled under a blanket, flinching at every little sound. Time dragged painfully slowly. The woods became eerily still. And then, we heard footsteps. Soft, deliberate footsteps. Moving between our tent and my parents' tent. Pacing, stopping, shifting around. We held our breath. The footsteps circled our car, stopped again, and moved back toward the woods. Then, headlights. That same old car returned, creeping slowly into the lot. Its headlights flooded our tents with light. Anna and I flattened ourselves to the ground, pretending we weren't there. Through the small mesh window of the tent, I peeked. I saw someone step out of the car, slam the door, and peel away, tires spinning. A wave of relief washed over me, but I kept watching. About 5 minutes later, flashing blue lights appeared. A police car sped past the lot, heading in the same direction the old car had gone. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night. Eventually, Anna and I abandoned the tent and moved into the locked car to feel safer. I stayed awake until nearly 5 a.m., staring into the dark woods. Too wired to sleep, Anna eventually dozed off beside me. Around sunrise, we cautiously went back to the tents. At 9 a.m., we woke my parents and told them everything. My mom's face went pale. She admitted she had heard something too. Heavy breathing right outside their tent around midnight, but thought it was her imagination. My dad had slept through the whole thing. We packed up as fast as humanly possible and got the hell out of there. We did make it to the amusement park and tried to enjoy ourselves. But later that night, curiosity got the better of me. I Googled the name of the forest, and my stomach dropped. Just a few months earlier, a man had been found murdered there, stabbed to death over gang debts. Even worse, 2 other men had disappeared from the beach nearby. Oops, and were never found. To this day, I wonder, who screamed in the woods that night? What was that shovel sound?
And what if the footsteps outside our tents had belonged to someone who didn't just want to scare us?
When my oldest son was around 8 or 9 years old, something strange started happening. He began sleepwalking. At first, I wasn't overly worried. I had heard that lots of kids go through a phase like that. And compared to all the horror stories I'd read, his episodes seemed mild. Still, it was unnerving. I'm a light sleeper, and most nights, if anyone so much as breathed too loud, it would wake me up. The first few times it happened, I would wake to find him standing in the hallway outside my bedroom door. He wouldn't say anything. He'd just sway gently from side to side. His eyes were open, but his gaze was blank, as if staring straight through me at something I couldn't see. Sometimes he would mutter under his breath, words I couldn't understand. Other times, he just stood there, silent and motionless. Each time, I would softly take him by the hand, whisper his name, and guide him back to bed. By morning, he never remembered a thing. At first, it seemed harmless enough, but after a few months, the incidents grew stranger. One night, I woke up to a new sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't rain. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It wasn't the house settling or any normal night noises. It was deliberate, steady, curious and uneasy. I got up and peeked into the hallway. There he was. My son stood facing the wall, his forehead lightly bumping against it, over and over again, in a slow, eerie rhythm. I stepped closer, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. Still, no reaction. He just kept tapping. It wasn't until I physically turned him around that he seemed to snap out of it. He blinked a few times, dazed, and let me lead him back to his room. The next morning, he had no memory of it at all. The episodes eventually tapered off. He grew out of it, or so I thought. Years passed, we barely spoke about it. It became just one of those weird family stories we occasionally mentioned around the holidays. Then, when my younger son was about the same age, it started happening again. At first, I laughed it off. Kids can be weird sometimes, right? Maybe it was genetic? But as time went on, my amusement faded into a gnawing dread. 'Cause it wasn't just that he sleepwalked, it was the way he did it, exactly the same way. Standing in the hallway at night, swaying, eyes wide open, but seeing nothing. And worse, the tapping, the exact same soft, steady tapping against the same section of the wall outside our bedroom. The same rhythmic bumping of his forehead against the plaster. I felt sick the first time I saw it. There was no way he could have known. He hadn't been born yet when his older brother went through this. There was no way he could mimic something he'd never seen. Still, I told myself it had to be coincidence. Coincidence or something much worse. As before, eventually he grew out of it. The house fell silent again. And I almost forgot, until a few months ago, with both boys now off at college, the house felt emptier than ever. My husband and I decided to finally start renovating a few rooms. New paint, new floors, basic updates. When we began peeling away the old wallpaper in the hallway, we noticed something odd. At first, I thought it was just an old discoloration, but as we kept stripping the paper away, we realized it was glass. A mirror. A full-length mirror had been hidden behind the wallpaper, perfectly flush with the wall, perfectly covered up. And where was it? exactly where both of my sons had spent night after night, gently tapping their foreheads. Chills ran down my spine. Neither of them could have known the mirror was there. We didn't even know. Yet somehow they were drawn to it. We ripped the mirror out and patched over the spot. But the feeling, that sickening feeling, never really went away. There has to be a logical explanation. There has to be. But deep down, I don't think I really believe that anymore.